97 people went to a football match and did not come home. One person has ever been convicted of anything connected to their deaths. He was fined £6,500. That is the complete criminal punishment 37 years on for the worst disaster in British sporting history. £67 per life. And the offense he was convicted of was not killing anyone. It was a paperwork failure about turnstiles. Here is what this story actually is, and it is not the story you think. Most people know the outline. Hillsborough, 1989, a crush, Liverpool supporters. Most people can even tell you the number, and most people get the number wrong. What almost nobody outside Britain knows is what happened in the 37 years after. Because the crush took about 6 minutes. The cover-up took a generation, and it is not finished. As I record this, a law is sitting in the House of Lords in London that exists because of what the police did after these people died. It passed the House of Commons 3 weeks ago. It has not yet been signed. So that is the map. We start on a Saturday afternoon in Sheffield with a football match that kicked off and was stopped 6 minutes later. We end in a parliament in 2026 with a bill that has taken longer to pass than most of the victims were alive. Between those 2 points, there is a lie told within 20 minutes of the first death. There are 164 police statements that were quietly edited. There is a newspaper front page that a city has refused to buy for 37 years. There are 2 criminal trials that collapsed. And there is a verdict in 2016 that took the longest case in English legal history to reach. I want to be careful here because 97 people died, and a lot of them were children. The youngest was 10. This is not going to be a video that lingers on how they died. It is going to be about what was done to them afterwards. Because the thing that makes Hillsborough different from a stadium collapse or a fire is not the disaster. Disasters happen. It is that the institution responsible for the deaths spent the next 23 years telling the country that the dead had killed themselves. And it very nearly worked. April the 15th, 1989, FA Cup semi-final, Liverpool against Nottingham Forest at Hillsborough, a neutral ground in Sheffield, home of Sheffield Wednesday. 54,000 people expected. Kickoff at 3. Start with the man in the control box, because everything else follows from him. Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield was put in command of that match 19 days before it happened. He had never commanded a football match at Hillsborough, not one. The officer he replaced, Chief Superintendent Brian Mole, had run the same fixture at the same ground the previous year. Liverpool against Nottingham Forest, same stand, same pens, and had been moved out of the division after a disciplinary incident involving officers and a probationary constable. The force called Mole's move career development. The inquests were given no explanation for why the most experienced football commander in the division was replaced 19 days before the biggest fixture of the season. Duckenfield later admitted, under oath, that he had not read the ground's safety certificate, that he knew very little about the layout of the terrace he was responsible for, that he did not know the standing area behind the goal was divided into separate pens with fixed capacities, and that those capacities could be exceeded while other parts of the ground stayed half empty. Now the geography, because the geography is the disaster. Liverpool's supporters were given the Leppings Lane end. Around 10,100 of them had to get in through 7 turnstiles. 7. For comparison, Nottingham Forest's fans, a smaller allocation, had over 20. Behind those turnstiles was a small concourse, and off that concourse was a tunnel that ran under the west stand and came out directly in the middle of the terrace. Pens 3 and 4, the 2 central pens, directly behind the goal. It was the obvious way in. It said "standing" above it. If you walked in and kept walking, that is where you ended up. In previous years, when the central pens filled, police had closed that tunnel and pushed arriving fans left and right into the side pens where there was space. On the 15th of April, 1989, nobody closed the tunnel. And one more thing about those pens, which is the detail that turns this from an accident into something else. They were cages. Steel fences at the front, steel radial fences at the sides, because English football in the 80s had decided its own supporters were the threat. The fencing was there to stop pitch invasions. It worked perfectly. When the crush came, there was nowhere forward, nowhere sideways, and nowhere back. Outside, by 2:30, the crush at the turnstiles was severe enough that people were being lifted off their feet. Superintendent Roger Marshall, the officer outside, later admitted the police had no system for counting how many people were already inside. He radioed the control box and asked for an exit gate to be opened to relieve the pressure. He asked once. He asked twice. At 2:52, on the third request, Duckenfield gave the order. Gate C was opened. Around 2,000 people came through in a few minutes. They had just spent an hour being crushed outside. They walked into a concourse, saw a tunnel, and went down it, towards a terrace that was already full. Duckenfield admitted at the inquests that when he ordered that gate opened, he gave no thought whatsoever to where those people would go. The game kicked off at 3 o'clock. It was stopped at 6 minutes past. And the first thing that happened, before a single ambulance reached the pitch, was that the story changed. Within roughly 20 minutes of the crush, with people still dying on the terrace, Duckenfield told Senior Football Association officials that Liverpool supporters had forced Gate C open and stormed in without tickets. He had ordered the gate opened himself. He admitted at the inquests, 26 years later, that this was a lie. His own word for it was terrible. But it was already out. It went to the FA. The FA repeated it, and by that evening, it was on the wires and in the newsrooms. The first draft of history was written before the last body was recovered, and it said the fans did this to themselves. Meanwhile, the response on the ground was slow and disorganized. Dozens of ambulances were outside the ground. Almost none got onto the pitch. Supporters tore down advertising hoardings and used them as stretchers to carry the injured the length of the field, past police officers who had been ordered to form a line across the halfway line, because the working assumption in the control box was still crowd trouble. The gymnasium at the stadium was turned into a temporary mortuary. Families who had driven across the country were shown Polaroid photographs of the dead to identify their own children. And then, in that same room, having just identified a body, they were questioned by police officers about how much the dead person had been drinking. And what I'm about to tell you is worth the like and the subscribe on its own. South Yorkshire police took blood alcohol samples from every single victim. All of them, including the children. The youngest person who died at Hillsborough was 10 years old, and the police tested his blood for alcohol. They then ran the names of the dead through the police national computer, looking for criminal records. They were building a case against the deceased. 4 days later, on the 19th of April, a national newspaper ran a front page under the headline, "The Truth." It alleged that Liverpool fans had picked the pockets of the dying, urinated on police officers, and beaten up an officer who was giving the kiss of life. There was no evidence for any of it, because none of it happened. 37 years later, that paper is still effectively unsellable in the city of Liverpool. Newsagents there stopped stocking it and never started again. Then came the part that took 23 years to surface. 164 police statements from that day were amended, not misfiled, edited. In 116 of them, comments were removed or altered, and the comments that went missing were the ones criticizing the police operation and the senior officers running it. Not everyone agrees on what that was. Some argue it was a force closing ranks and rewriting the record to escape blame. an organized cover-up by any ordinary meaning of the phrase. Others point out, correctly, that the officers who did the editing were later cleared by a court, and that the statements were being prepared for a public inquiry, not a criminal trial. Whether that is a cover-up or a legal technicality that happens to look exactly like one, that is a debate worth having. Here is where it lands. The original inquests, held in 1990 and 1991, imposed a cutoff. The coroner ruled that everyone who died was beyond saving by 15 minutes past 3, and refused to hear evidence about anything after that time. That single ruling made the entire emergency response, the ambulances that never came, the hour of chaos, legally irrelevant. The verdict was accidental death. For the families, that was the bottom. Their children were dead. The country believed they were drunks who had killed themselves, and the law had just closed the file. What the families did next has no real equivalent anywhere in sport. They did not go away. For 23 years, mothers and fathers with no legal training and no money learned freedom of information law, cataloged documents, sat through every hearing, and refused every invitation to move on. Some of them died before anything changed. On the 12th of September 2012, the Hillsborough Independent Panel published its report. It had been given access to over 400,000 documents. It confirmed the statement amendments. It confirmed the blood alcohol testing. It confirmed the briefing against the dead. And it concluded that as many as 41 of the 96 could have survived with a faster emergency response, which is to say, the 15 minutes past 3 cutoff had been wrong and had buried the question for 2 decades. That December, the original inquests were quashed. The new inquests opened in Warrington in March 2014 and ran for over 2 years. They became the longest case ever heard in English legal history. On the 26th of April 2016, the jury returned. The 96 were unlawfully killed. And on the question of whether the behavior of Liverpool supporters contributed to the danger, the jury answered no. Not insufficient evidence, no. 27 years to have the country formally state that the victims had not killed themselves. And then, having established that 96 people were unlawfully killed, the criminal justice system convicted nobody of it. David Duckenfield was tried for gross negligence manslaughter. The first jury could not agree. At the retrial on the 28th of November 2019, he was found not guilty. In May 2021, 2 retired senior officers and the force's former solicitor stood trial for perverting the course of justice over the amended statements. After 4 weeks, the judge ruled there was no case to answer. His reasoning was that the statements had been altered for the Taylor public inquiry, and a public inquiry, in law, is not a course of public justice. The charge simply did not fit what they had done. Which leaves Graham McCrell, Sheffield Wednesday's club secretary and safety officer, convicted in April 2019 of a failure under the Health and Safety at Work Act relating to the turnstile arrangements. Fined £6,500. That is the sum total. 1 man, 1 fine, 1 paperwork offense. There is one thing that did change, and it changed fast. And if you have ever watched a Premier League match, you have seen it. Lord Justice Taylor's report, published within months, found that the main cause of the disaster was a failure of police control. It also recommended the end of standing terraces at the top level of English football. The fences came down. The pens went. Within 5 years, the entire top division was all cedar, and the model spread across Europe and beyond. So the stadium you watch football in today, the seat with a number on it, the absence of a cage between you and the pitch, that is Hillsborough. 97 people paid for that, and the institution that killed them paid £6,500. Two more things you need to know. On the 27th of July, 2021, Andrew Devine died in Liverpool at the age of 55. He had been 22 at the match. He spent 32 years unable to walk or speak, cared for by his family. The coroner ruled that he too was unlawfully killed, as a direct result of what happened that afternoon. Which is why the number is 97, and why almost every video you will find about this still says 96. And on the 14th of July, 2026, 3 weeks before I recorded this, the House of Commons passed the Public Office Accountability Bill. Everyone calls it the Hillsborough Law. It creates a legal duty of candor. A public official who misleads an inquiry into a disaster commits a criminal offense. It gives bereaved families legal funding to match the states. It exists because in 1989, lying about the dead cost the people who did it precisely nothing. It is in the House of Lords now. It is not law yet. 37 years, 97 people, one fine of £6,500, and a bill that still has not been signed.